it's Dr. Gilchrist, and because we are not having class on Friday, because I will be at an assessment workshop, one of the things that I wanted to do today is give you a lecture that you can watch instead of coming to class on Friday. So I'm probably going to keep this to about 30 minutes so that way we have time to actually discuss some of these topics in class. So I'll try not to go over 30 minutes for this recording. But we are starting a new section. We are going to talk about attention, and this is chapter 3 in your book. Okay. So here's kind of what we're going to cover. So in general, I do kind of want you to skip the, let me see, I think the new edition, there is a section on attention and consciousness. You can read it if you are interested, but I am not going to test you on that. But here's what we're going to kind of cover in this section. So we are going to start by talking a little bit about auditory attention, and then we will talk about visual attention. In particular, we will focus on visual search. Then we will discuss probably what I think will be one of your most favorite sections in this unit, cross-modal effects, looking at how we use auditory and visual inputs and which one is more important than the other when we're trying to pay attention to a message. We're going to talk about multitasking. And then we're going to talk about disorders of attention. Like I said, you can read the section on attention and consciousness if you wish, but it's not necessary for the class. Okay, so when we talk about attention, it's one of those kind of things where you might know it if you see it. You know when you're not paying attention to something. So if you're kind of zoning out in lecture and you're not really paying attention to what your instructor is saying, it's really easy to notice when you don't have attention. And it's kind of easy to notice when you do have attention. You're focused. You're aware of what is being said or what you are watching. But if we want to work with a formal definition of attention, I always like to follow this quote from William James, and it's also in your textbook. This comes from his textbook, Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890. Now, bear in mind, William James didn't actually do experiments. I tend to regard him more as an armchair philosopher rather than a psychologist. But one of the things that's kind of interesting about James is he did read the work of other people that were doing psychology research, and many of the things that he posited in Principles of Psychology have actually done a really good job of holding up. He's one of the first people to talk about short-term versus long-term memory, and his ideas about attention still hold true as well. Attention is the taking into possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. And I chose to italicize what I think is most important from this quote. What you can kind of see in this instance is that attention is a process of prioritization. So there is that focus, but what is also critically important about attention is that you can't pay attention to everything. And I know what some of you are thinking, I can pay attention to everything, Dr. Gilchrist. No, you can't. I'm a professor, I study attention, and even I cannot pay attention to everything. Some things have to take priority. And so when we talk about attention, attention is all about selecting some information or prioritizing some information or processes over others. So there are two different means of attentional processing. So we can focus our attention in a top-down way. This is a very active, internally driven attentional focusing. So for example, if you are trying to study for a test and you know that this test is very, very important, what you are probably going to do is use your willpower, your motivation, and and this is going to be done in a very goal-directed way, you're going to actively focus your attention. You are the one that is driving that in a top-down way. Now, sometimes another term that we use for this is endogenous. The idea behind endogenous is that it is internally generated. It comes from you. Now, we can also process our attention in a bottom-up way. So this is a very passive attentional processing. This comes from something outside of yourself. So sometimes another term that we use for this bottom-up attentional processing is exogenous, because it comes from something outside of ourselves. So for example, you could be in class listening to a lecture and then suddenly the fire alarm goes off. All of a sudden your attention is going to shift to that fire alarm because that attention has been drawn and taken from you in a very, very passive way. So this is something that is not generated from you. This is something that happens because of something that grabs your attention in your external environment. And in addition to the two different ways that we can actually allocate our attention, we can have two very different types of attention that we are doing. So the first type of attention is the type of attention that I tend to focus upon, pun not intended. This is focused or selective attention. So the idea here is that we are going to attend to one source of information and we're going to ignore everything else. On the other hand, we can also do something that is called divided attention. This is when we are doing two or more tasks at the same time. So in this instance, you're basically multitasking. Now, what's kind of critical about this is not a case where you can do one of the tasks really well and just be kind of mediocre or poor at the other task. All of the items have to be attended. So for you to be able to perform successfully in divided attention, you are either going to have to divide your attention equally between the two tasks, or you are going to have to shift your attention back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between the tasks. Your book also provides you with a few different examples of each of these different types. So for example, your textbook kind of says that selective attention occurs when you are trying to search the environment for a particular target, like a visual search task. There are going to be other items in your visual field that are going to compete for your attention, but you're trying to focus your attention on finding a particular target. So for example, looking out a window to see where your cat is. In the case of divided attention, you can often kind of think about this as kind of looking at your phone while you are trying to have a conversation with a friend. Your friend is going to probably want you to have a good conversation with them, and you're probably wanting to get whatever information it is you are seeking to achieve off of your phone. So in this case, you have to do both of those and pay attention to those equally well. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about selective auditory attention. Now, because we aren't having class on Friday, there is a demonstration that I am going to do when we're back in class on Monday to kind of demonstrate the power of our auditory attention. But to talk about this a little bit, probably when we talk about auditory attention, what we often tend to think about is Colin Cherry's work on what he termed the cocktail party effect. So this is basically the idea that oftentimes when you're at a party or you're at a gathering with lots of other people, or when you're in a dining hall with lots of different conversations going on around you, something kind of amazing happens. So you're probably having a conversation with a friend at your table, and you're able, despite the fact that there's all this other noise going on around you, despite all of these things, you are capable of maintaining a conversation with your friend in the midst of all this noise, and what's more, you don't really know the content of the conversations going on around you besides the one that you are paying attention to. So Cherry kind of found this cocktail party effect, and one of the things that he found is that one of the ways that we kind of maintain our attention in these types of situations is by using actual physical differences of the stimuli. So that could be the perceived sex or gender of the speaker, that could be the voice intensity or the location of the speaker, to kind of figure out what I should be paying attention to and what I should be ignoring. What's interesting is that if you don't have those differences available, such as location or intensity, so Cherry actually found that when you present two messages to each ear, so you can't use things like location or intensity to differentiate the different voices, we do actually find that it's really hard to separate those two messages because they are equally distant and there are no physical differences that you can really use to differentiate the two. So research on auditory attention led to a couple of different researchers coming up with different theories for how this auditory attention works. So we're going to talk about a few of them. Your book goes into a little bit less detail than I will. I'm actually going to show you some pictures here of what these proposed attentional theories are. But we're going to talk about the early filter theory of Donald Broadbent and TREISMAN'S leaky filter theory, or sometimes it's called her attenuated filter theory. And then finally, the late filter theory proposed by Deutsch and Deutsch. So we are picking one voice out of many when we are engaged in an auditory selective attention task. And as I've already mentioned, Cherry found that we typically will use physical differences to maintain our attention and filter out any other noises or voices that might be considered irrelevant, such as the speaker's supposed sex or location. When we don't have those differences available, such as in a dichotic listening task where we're getting two messages sent to both ears, this is much, much harder to do. And one of the things that Cherry and other attentional researchers have done to look at this, and we are going to try this on Monday, is what is called a shadowing task. So the idea behind shadowing is that we're going to take a dichotic listening task. So I've got one message being sent to one ear, one message being sent to another ear, and I'm told to pay attention to one and ignore the other. So for example, maybe I am told to pay attention to the message that's in my left ear, but ignore what's in my right. What's more, I am going to be asked to repeat back everything I hear in the left ear. And I am told to ignore anything that might be in my right ear. So the shadowing task, I'm basically going to repeat back everything I hear in the ear or to the message that I'm being told I need to pay attention to. And this can be very, very difficult. But what we tend to find is that people can manage to do this pretty well, even if it's hard. Cherry actually found that in the unattended ear, the ear that you don't have to listen to and you don't have to shadow from, they could switch the message to a foreign language. They could basically reverse the speech and make it go backwards. And in general, most people didn't notice the difference. So they wouldn't notice that the language in the unattended channel had changed. But what's interesting is that physical changes to the message, like shifting to pure tones, actually did get paid attention to. Research has also found that sometimes if you present somebody's name which is a very, very important thing to most of us. Our names are part of who we are. They're very important. If you present somebody's name in the unattended channel, sometimes that information breaks through and people report hearing it, even though they don't remember any of the other content of the message itself. So we're going to try this on Monday, and we're going to see if it works. But one of the things that we do know, based on the work that has been done on shadowing tasks and dichotic listening, as well as you're going to see in the demonstration in class, is that our attention is limited. And it's especially limited for auditory information. There's only so much auditory information that we can process at once. So one theory that has been proposed by a lot of researchers as to why our auditory attention is so limited is due to there being what they refer to as a processing bottleneck. So it kind of works like the neck of a bottle. So imagine that you've got a lot of liquid in this bottle. Only some of that liquid is going to be able to come out at once in the bottleneck. So the idea here is that we have many, many different sensory inputs, many, many different auditory inputs, but only some of those we can pay attention to. So attention basically can act as a bottleneck for incoming sensory information. There's only so much that you're going to be able to pay attention to, and that kind of cuts down and narrows the different sensory inputs that we are getting. So the bottleneck actually limits our ability to process 2 or more inputs simultaneously. So we generally tend to agree that there is a bottleneck. Where we often tend to find that there is considerably more disagreement is where the bottleneck is located. So there's disagreement on where or when in processing this bottleneck ultimately occurs. So we're going to talk about a few different theories about where the bottleneck occurs. So we agree that there is a bottleneck. We just don't really know where it is. So we're going to talk about a few of those different theories now. So we're going to start with Donald Broadbent's early filter theory, which was originally developed around 1958. So this, we call it an early filter because it occurs very, very early on in processing. So you can kind of see from this image what that theory kind of looks like. So here we have different types of sensory information. Because we're talking about the auditory sense, you can assume that this would be our auditory sensory memory or a buffer of some kind. So a little short-term store for auditory information. So multiple auditory messages can access the buffer in parallel. Now here we're only talking about 2, but it could potentially be more than that if you have a lot of auditory information going on around you. Almost immediately after reaching this sensory buffer, we have a selective filter. Only one input can access that filter at a time. That one gets attended to and then later can access short-term memory. So it's going to be what accesses the filter is actually kind of based on its physical characteristics. The other input that you can see here that doesn't get access to the filter is basically going to be rejected and potentially lost forever. We're going to see later that Broadbent modified his theory so that if we can pay attention to this quickly enough, after we're done processing this input, we actually can get the unattended sensory information to then be attended to. So if the filter can shift very quickly, we can pay attention to both, but this doesn't necessarily happen all of the time. So the other input is in this auditory sensory buffer and will degrade unless we pay attention to it very, very quickly. So where did Broadbent get this idea for this filter theory? Part of it is that he actually had studies and had read studies and was familiar with studies where people were basically presented with a dichotic listening tasks. They're getting information to both ears, and there were 3 digits that were presented to one ear at the same time, as another set of 3 digits was presented to the opposite ear. So you're getting one set of 3 digits here, you're getting one set of 3 digits here, and these are being presented at the same time. Now here's where it gets really hard. You are asked to report back all of the digits that you can hear. What's really interesting is that most people recall the digits by ear rather than by pair. So in your textbook on page 94, I'm on the e-textbook. Thus, if 496 were presented to one ear and 852 to the other ear, recall would be 496, 852 rather than 489562. This suggested that the digits on one ear were stored briefly while those on the other ear were processed. So basically, here's the input from one ear. It gets access to the filter and put in short-term memory, and then very quickly the filter shifts to get to that other ear, which is still in that sensory buffer. So additionally, research has actually found that there is some evidence that we can choose what we listen to in this early filter theory based on meaning. So semantic content rather than physical characteristics such as recalling by ear or speaker sex or things like that. So Morey in 1959 actually found that in a dichotic listening task, participants could report hearing their name in an unattended channel. So if they were told to pay attention to information in this ear and ignore this ear, if I present the participant's name in this ear, 1/3 of participants reported hearing it, even if they did not hear any or understand any of the other content being presented. Andy Conway, Nelson Cowan, and Michael Bunting actually found in 2001 that being able to identify your own name in an unattended channel might be based on how much information you can store in your working memory, or what we call working memory capacity. Interestingly enough, a lot of other researchers actually believe that working memory capacity, the short-term memory ability, is also based on how well you control your attention. So we do actually find this can depend on how well you control your attention. But there's a couple of problems with Broadbent's theory, and that's where TREISMAN kind of comes in. TREISMAN reported that sometimes information in an unattended channel can break through depending on the context of the message, and she reported this in 1960. So here we have a dichotic listening task, and what we're going to find is that depending on the task, information is going to shift from one ear to the other. So here's a really clever task. So they need to pay attention to information in this ear and ignore the information in this ear. So at the same time that they're getting "I saw the girl," and then they go "song was wishing," we have "me that bird," and then we get "jumping in the street." So all of a sudden, the information that they're expecting in line with the context of the sentence shifts to the unattended ear. Now, if they are perfectly ignoring information in this ear, they should shadow back "I saw the girl, song was wishing." But when you ask participants to actually shadow this, many people actually report "I saw the girl jumping in the street." They're not supposed to be paying attention to anything in that ear. What it suggests is that depending on the context of the message that they're attending to, sometimes information that we are told not to pay attention to can actually break through the message. So sometimes unattended information based on the content of a message can actually break through. And this led Treisman to develop what we sometimes call our attenuated filter theory, or the leaky filter theory. So Treisman believed that the bottleneck is a little bit more flexible than Broadbent initially supposed. So sometimes this leaky filter theory is also called attenuation theory. So the idea here is that unattended information is not completely ignored, it's just attenuated, it's weakened, it's not as prioritized, but that doesn't mean that it's completely ignored entirely. So the idea here is that there is a hierarchy for how we choose to analyze stimuli. So Treisman believed that we tend to start by processing information from the message at the surface, and then finally we are able to kind of process the deeper meaning, the syntactical structure, and things like that. So we start with processing on the basis of physical cues, and then syllable patterns, and then we finally get to that meaning. If our attention is at capacity, those higher order analyses don't happen. So one of the things that we're going to find is that all of this happens for the attended channel. If we have some extra space, this can happen for the unattended channel as well. But oftentimes we'll find it that if attention is already at capacity, we're not really going to pay attention to the unattended channel. Additionally, Treisman did report that there are lowered thresholds for context-relevant stimuli. So what this means is that those get analyzed more easily than they normally would, even if they're already in the unattended channel. Your name, for example, is especially relevant and context-specific to you. And so as a result of that, you're going to occasionally notice your name in an unattended channel because it's relevant to context and it has a lowered threshold for being attended. So that's kind of Treisman's theory. And then finally, at the other end of the extreme of Broadbent's theory, we have Deutsch and Deutsch's late selection theory. This basically comes up with the idea that all stimuli are fully analyzed. So here we have two different auditory messages. Both of them have access to auditory processing, and then the filter occurs relatively late in short-term memory. So the stimulus that is the most relevant to one's particular context is going to determine the response. So there is some evidence, very strong evidence, that shows that this is absolutely not the case. And this comes from work by Treisman and Riley back in 1969. So they had people engage in a dichotic listening task with one ear that they were supposed to pay attention to and one ear that they were not supposed to pay attention to. And what they were told is that there's a target word that they're going to be looking for, and they need to tap whenever the target word is detected in both the attended channel and your unattended channel. Now, according to the late selection theory, this shouldn't matter. You should be able to recognize the target word equally well because all stimuli are fully analyzed. So you would figure equal detection of targets if late selection theory holds true. We actually find, though, that there was a significant difference in target detection depending on whether the channel was attended or unattended. So when you had the target word present in the unattended channel, it was only detected 8% of the time. When it was in the attended channel, it was detected 87% of the time. So this shows some pretty strong evidence against late selection theory. The bottleneck is probably occurring before some stimuli have the chance to be fully analyzed. So let's kind of go back and think about the bottleneck theories in particular. So there is a lot of support for an early filter with possible attentional shifting. Our attention can shift to the unattended channel if we have enough opportunity to do so. And again, this comes from research from Broadbent himself that showed that listeners tend to recall digit lists by ear rather than by pair. So they report the one they hear in the attended channel, and then they have enough time to pull the unattended channel's message from that sensory buffer, analyze it, and then report it. And additionally, this shifting is not always on the basis of surface features like what the message sounds like, what the location is, what the gender of the speaker is. It could be context or meaning. And generally, we're going to find that a bottleneck is more likely to occur when inputs are a lot like each other. So if I have two different auditory messages, but they sound really different from each other, I'm going to probably be able to notice and pay attention to those more than if I have identical messages being said by the same speaker with no physical characteristics or differences at all to distinguish them. So we're at about 30 minutes here. We will do that shadowing task at the beginning of class on Monday. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And the next time we are here, we will start to talk about visual attention, including different metaphors that we use to pay attention to stimuli. Bye, everybody.